How are we doing? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dalton Rupp. I'm a political science student here in the MSU Denver Honors Program. And today I'd like to talk to you all about information. And specifically, I'd like to talk about our personal data, both the power that it gives to those who have access to it, and why we should all be especially mindful of how it is used. Now, it's no secret that there are a ton of people who are interested in our personal information. Credit card companies are interested in our financial history and their spending habits. Healthcare and insurance providers are interested in our lifestyle and health data. Marketers and advertising agencies are interested in where we shop and what we buy. Even CPAP machines are interested in data related to how we breathe at night. Now, the current research shows that most Americans, in fact nearly all Americans, place a very high value on their personal data, both in knowing what kinds of their information is accessible and who has access to it. Now, over the past decade or so, a number of scandals have been brought to light in the United States regarding the responsible and ethical use of our personal data, whether it's a government agency like the NSA collecting the telephone and email records of hundreds of thousands of Americans without their knowledge, a social media company like Facebook allowing a third-party political firm to gain access to the data of millions and millions of its users, information that was, by the way, used to manipulate and sway public opinion during the presidential election, or a company like Google, who, while it was creating the 3D Street View portion of its Google Maps application, was simultaneously collecting a massive amount of personal data from people's homes, things like their internet and email histories, their online account passwords, and making this data available to advertisers worldwide without the knowledge or the consent of the individuals from whom it collected that personal information. Now, scandals like these and dozens of others have caused a loss of trust on part of the American people that our personal information is being used ethically and responsibly. As you can see up here, just about half of all Americans do not trust either the government or social media companies to actually protect their personal information, and 91% of U.S. adults feel as though they have lost control over their own personal data and being able to determine who has access to it and what they use it for. Now, unfortunately for us, our laws and policies surrounding the responsible use and collection of personal data are still ambiguous. They're ambiguous enough to lead to a ton of lawsuits that have to deal with this specific issue. You have individuals fighting with social media companies, arguing with government agencies, arguing with online service providers, all trying to figure out and determine who has ownership of this data and how can they responsibly use that personal information. Now, just because the policies and the social and ethical norms that we expect people to abide by when they collect and use personal data are still quite unclear, I would like to propose that rather than get lost in all this confusion, one possible remedy for finding out what we can do to overcome these challenges is actually looking outside of our own borders here in the U.S. and examining the policy strategy of other countries in the world and trying to identify how they have dealt with these same kinds of challenges. Now, when it comes to personal data policy, there is one state in particular that I think merits a very special kind of attention, and that is China. Now, China is home to the largest concentration of online internet users in the entire world. There are over 800 million people in China who are connected to the internet. To put that into perspective, that's more people than all of the United States and the entirety of Europe put together. China is also home to 8 of the 20 largest technology companies in the entire world. The other 12 are all US-based companies. And now China is also home to the most ambitious and consequential personal data policy the world has ever seen. Why would I say this? Well, that's because China is in the process of creating a nationwide, state-sponsored data collection apparatus. And this is the Chinese social credit system, and it's extremely important because China believes that through this new data policy, they will build a socialist, harmonious society, simultaneously raising the credit and integrity of the entire nation. Now, this evening, I'd like to argue that the Chinese social credit system is instead one of the first steps that we have seen in the 21st century of a state trying to create a fully incorporated social control, and state surveillance apparatus. Why would I say this? Well, that's because the Chinese social credit system is an all-encompassing data policy. It collects personal information from nearly every arena of Chinese life and then uses this information to analyze an individual Chinese citizen's behavior. And through the analysis of that person's behavior, the social credit system then issues each individual Chinese citizen an overall social credit rating, or a score. Now, this score is supposed to reflect how trustworthy or untrustworthy that specific citizen is as an actor in Chinese society. Essentially, this is a policy that is designed to determine who the good citizens are and who the bad ones are. Now, you may be wondering how something like this is even possible in a state as large and complex as China. Well, it starts from a very simple point. It starts with the collection of personal data. Now, as of right now in China, there are over 50 central government agencies cooperating with one another, cooperating with local Chinese governments, with Chinese businesses, and some of those gigantic Chinese tech corporations to collect a massive amount of personal data on Chinese citizens. What kind of information are we talking about here? Well, if you're a Chinese citizen, for example, your legal information can be collected by the Chinese court system and the judicial authorities. All of your financial information can be collected from Chinese financial firms and public banks like the People's Bank of China and all of its local subsidiaries. Security information regarding your behavior can be collected by law enforcement using more traditional surveillance techniques like CCTV cameras and facial recognition technologies. All of your employment data can be gathered by employers and Chinese businesses. And importantly, all of your social data. These are things like how you use social media, what you post online, where you go because of your GPS and your location data. These pieces of information can be collected from social media companies in China, those technology corporations, and online service providers, many of whom have actually been given a license from the government to share their user data as part of this social credit system. Now, it's important to note that under each one of these categories, there are several much more specific pieces of information that are collected, and it's far more than what I have up here. This is just an example. Under each one of these categories could be tens of thousands or millions of very specific individual pieces of data on every Chinese citizen that the social credit system then collects. Now, the next step in this process is the aggregation of all of this personal information into a centralized infrastructure. Here's a little visual representation of what that may look like. Behind me, you'll see a couple dozen central government agencies who collect personal data in each of their respective areas and then combine all of that information into a central database. Now, what this does is it allows the social credit system to actually start building very specific individual profiles of each citizen with all of that information included. And next, the social credit system analyzes all of that information using certain criteria to determine a person's behavior in all of those instances. Now, you're probably wondering, what is the actual criteria on which the social credit system makes these decisions? Well, as far as we know, all of the criteria and standards that the social credit system uses to judge individuals is determined by the state government itself. So, how much debt is it okay to have in proportion to my income? How many traffic violations is it okay to accrue in 5 or 10 years? What can I buy online? What is it not a good idea to buy online? The state has an answer for all of these questions, and it sets that as a standard in each area. And the social credit system uses that state standard as a criteria on which it judges individual citizens. Now, it's important to point out that this does not exist on a national level yet. That's planned for 2020 by the Chinese government. But several more local kind of pilot social credit system programs have been tested out by the Chinese government in various Chinese cities since the early to mid 2000s. And they've been tested with quite a lot of success. So let's talk a little bit more about what behaviors would actually affect someone's social credit score in China. So, for example, if you're someone who has a good financial history, you have very little debt, no criminal background, you have a very lucrative job, and you are highly educated, all of these behaviors are things that would lead you to have a higher overall social credit score. Also included that is outward support of the Chinese Communist Party policies and agendas. On the other hand, if you're someone who has a poor financial history, or you have a lot of debt, or perhaps you have a criminal background, or you get poor performance reviews from your employer, all of these things can lead one to maintain a lower social credit score. Now, although some of those factors that I just talked about may seem like fairly reasonable metrics to use when analyzing how responsible someone is, the social credit system is actually interested in some more innocuous and seemingly innocent behaviors that people take part in China. For example, if you're a citizen who lives in the city of Rongcheng, which is a Chinese city that has its own social credit system policy, and you frequently purchase video games online, that can lead you to have a lower social credit score, because in the eyes of the government, the frequent purchasing of video games is indicative of irresponsible and lazy behavior. However, if you purchase a lot of books in the city of Rongcheng online, that can also negatively impact your social credit score, because the state government is not particularly interested in the promotion of dissident thinking among its citizens. Now, if you're a citizen in the city of Beijing, which has its own social credit system policy, and you frequently visit mosques or churches for prayer or religious services, that can also negatively impact your social credit score. So why is the social credit score actually important? Well, that's because the third and final part of the social credit system policy is the enforcement stage. Now, depending on your social credit score, you may be eligible for certain benefits or subject to certain punishments from the state itself. So, for example, if you're someone who has a high social credit score, you may get reduced fare when you buy airplane and train tickets. You may get lower interest rates when you take out a loan. You can get expedited travel visas. You can get fast tracks for applying to accredited academic institutions and certain job positions. And you can even, if you have a very high social credit score, get your name and your photograph posted on a trustworthy citizen board outside of a public building like a school or a library. On the other hand, if you have a very low social credit score, you will be subject to punishments. You may instead have increased rates on your interest when you borrow money. You could find that your monthly bills, like your heating, your cell, and your electric bill, have gone up. You may be restricted from participating in the Chinese financial markets or from purchasing luxury or goods and services like nice hotel rooms. You can be banned from purchasing airplane and train tickets. As of 2019, 5.5 million Chinese citizens were unable to purchase train tickets because they had a low social credit score. And 17.5 million were unable to purchase plane tickets, either domestically or internationally, because of their social credit score. And these bans can be indefinite. There is no standard as to how long they last. As was the case for people who had a high social credit score, if you have a low social credit score, you may also find your name and your photograph, along with a detailed description of your bad behavior, publicly displayed outside of a heavily trafficked area, like a busy four-way intersection or a train station. Now, perhaps the most sinister aspect of this social credit system policy is that an individual's social credit score does not just affect their behavior, it affects the behavior of their friends and their family, because the social credit system know who those people are. So for example, if you maintain a low social credit score, your own kids may be barred from applying to certain academic institutions because of that score. Or one of your family members may be unable to apply for a certain public position because of that low social credit score. What does this mean? Well, it means if someone has a low social credit score, they may find that their own friends and family begin disassociating from them out of fear that their scores will be affected because of that relationship. Now, I hope it's starting to become a little more clear what the end goal of this policy actually is. But in case you're unsure, I can't actually say it any better than the Chinese government already has. Now, whether or not the social credit system is fully established at the national level next year or 5 years from now or even 10 years from now is actually beside the point, because the methods and the goals of this system have already been spelled out for us to see. And China has also made it known that it wants this social credit system policy to spread well beyond its own borders in the hopes of creating an international credit system that looks like this and judges people based on these same metrics. Now, I hope it doesn't take a lot for you to imagine what a state-run, state-enforced social credit system would look like in places like Russia, or Saudi Arabia, or Uganda, places with a history of authoritarian persecution against journalists, political activists, and marginal communities. So what can we learn from this? I said we were going to learn something at the beginning of this talk. So what can we learn? Well, first and foremost, as Eric so beautifully put it already, I think we can learn that developing wise and reasonable protections when it comes to how our personal data is collected and used is going to be a top priority, or should be a top priority, for our policymakers here in the United States. However, I also believe that we can start to recognize how some of our own practices in terms of determining things like credit and eligibility here in the US rely on processes that are not that different from those used in China. More and more institutions in the United States are collecting our personal and social information, things like how we use social media, what we post online, our political views, our location, our shopping history. Is it starting to sound a little familiar? Okay. Even our dietary habits are all pieces of information that credit reporting agencies, marketing and advertising agencies, healthcare and insurance providers, and employers collect to make determinations about things like our insurance premiums, whether or not we're qualified for a certain job, or what our eligibility for certain benefits. And the problem with using data analytics like this without the proper human oversight is that it can actually disparately affect people. And it can arbitrarily punish people based not on their own action, but because of the actions of others, or just based on inaccurate or outdated data. There are plenty of cases in the United States of people now being penalized on their financial credit score, not because of any of their own behavior, but simply because they like to shop at certain establishments where the clientele typically has a lower credit score. There are plenty of cases of people being denied access to certain benefits, although they are eligible, simply because of where they live or their location, being a historically impoverished community. Now, going back to China, I think China serves as a wonderful example of exactly where we do not want to go in the realm of data policy moving forward. And I also believe that it serves as an excellent motivator for us to start thinking very seriously about what kind of legal protections and what kind of social and ethical norms we want ourselves and our companies and our government to take seriously when they engage in data collection and the use of personal data. And I think we need to get these things out of the way so that we can finally focus on things that are a little more exciting and less depressing than this, going to Mars or something crazy. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.